IVM.
Hey, it's been another great week on IVM. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. On Cyrus Says this week, we have Satyanshu Singh, filmmaker, writer, and head of content development for AIB First Draft. His journey from doctor to writer is a fascinating one. On The Seen and the Unseen, Amit is joined by Pranay Kotastane and Hamsini to decode Pakistan's experiences with democracy. On Keeping It Queer this week, Naveen speaks to Parmesh Sahani, author and head of the Godrej India Culture Lab. Hustle Science marks the season finale with fitness YouTuber Abhinav Mahajan. And on Geek Fruit, Tejas and Jishnu give you the greatest hits from this year's San Diego Comic-Con. It's time for you to catch the third story from Croc Tales with Anand Sivakumaran. This one is called Freddy Ki Fiat Ho Gayi Flat. And now, onto your shows.
There's a need for a new world order, but it has different characteristics in different parts of the world.
We assembled here today are issuing a new decree to be heard in every city, in every foreign capital, and in every hall of power. From this day forward, a new vision will govern our land. From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first.
There cannot be peace without first a great suffering. The greater the suffering, the greater the peace. The end you've always feared is coming. It's coming. And the blood will be on your hands.
Everyone from Henry Kissinger and Donald Trump to Solomon Lane in the new Mission Impossible movie cares about the end of the old world order. Today, we are going to envision a new world order and our place in it. This is the Pragati podcast, and I'm your host, Hamsini Hariharan. Every week, my co-host, Pawan Srinath and I get together to discuss policy, international relations, and economics. The latest Mission Impossible movie got me wondering, what is the world order? How is it changing? Why is it changing? And most importantly, what should India be doing about it? Our guests for the day are Pranay Kotastane and Anirudh Khanisetti, researchers at the Takshashila Institution. Pranay also hosts a Hindi podcast called Puliyabazi that you should check out if you haven't already. We're going to break down the world order. Not literally, of course. But first, here's a short commercial break.
Some time ago, 5 successful restaurateurs came together to form the Colaba cartel. The founders of the table, Gauri Devi Dayal and Jay Yusuf, partnered with the founders of Woodside Inn, Abhishek Honawar, Pankil Shah, and Sumit Gambhir to open a new restaurant in Colaba. If you've ever dreamed of opening a restaurant or love eating out, you want to listen in. The Colaba Cartel. This exclusive 10-part series is hosted by Gauri Devi Dayal and Amit Doshi. Catch new episodes of the Colaba Cartel every Monday and Thursday on the IVM Podcasts app, website, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi Pranay, welcome to the show, and hi Anirudh, welcome to the show for the first time.
Thank you, Pawan.
Thanks, Pawan.
Pranay, we've been hearing a lot about the idea of a world order and that we are heading into a new world order. And you and Anirudh and also I think Anupam have worked on a discussion document as well on, what new world order we might be heading to and what India must do and so on. But what is this business? What's the world order?
Yeah, the world order has become, this word which is dominating. I think if you do a Google Trends analysis, world order would have suddenly shot up over the last 2-3 years. Right? And everyone, the common metaphors that you hear are world order is in a flux, there are fundamental changes happening, shifts happening and all that. So let's get to what this definition is. And I want to explain it at sort of a few levels. At the very basic level, world order means the concept which is held by a region, civilization or state about what is a just arrangement of the distribution of power across the world. Okay, so that's it. It is very similar to something called a world view. Okay, now this is one level. The second level is what we call international order, International order refers to the practical application of what you or I as a state might feel to substantial parts of the world. And the third one is a regional order, which means when these ideas of just arrangements of powers are only applicable in a substantial manner to a region. And that's what you call regional. Examples of this would be an international order would be something which we call the Westphalian order, or a liberal international order, which will be, I'm sure we'll discuss in greater detail later. Regional order would be things like when we say a Chinese order around the areas which China dominates now.
Or India sort of being the biggest power in the Indian subcontinent.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So tell us more about this. So what would define a good world order? So first off, you said that it's like a worldview, right? So if there are a lot of people who believe that, globalism is driven by big corporations and America is, this great source of evil and modern exploitation in the world, that constitutes a worldview, right? So is that the same as a world order, or how does it work?
So there is a very good book called World Order by Henry Kissinger, which actually tries to answer some of these questions. So if I have to just bring in his views on this, and then we'll add the insights that we had when we wrote our paper. So for Kissinger, the world order is basically determined by two factors. One is legitimacy and one is power. Okay, he says both are required
and both are different.
Yeah, both are absolutely different. When we say legitimacy, legitimacy means whether you accept whatever status I have, right? So there should be a broader feeling that let's say the legitimacy of US as a dominant power. The legitimacy exists because most of the countries are okay with it and they are okay with the way US is functioning. So that is one idea. Power is just my ability to influence what you do irrespective of what you think. Okay, so you might not necessarily agree that it is legitimate or not, but if I have the stick, I can make you do what I want, or I hope so.
Okay, so in that sense, is legitimacy like you don't have to use coercion to get someone to agree with you, but people sort of broadly agree with your principles and ideas, and so therefore you are
exactly
legitimate.
Yeah, it's like they agree to your principles so much that they don't question why those principles are there in the first place at all. For example, now democracy is what US pushed as a value that should be there across the world. It's a new idea, right? Just it was not even there in the Europe when Europe was a dominant power in the world. But once US came into being the dominant power, it's become such a legitimate idea that everyone across the world always talks about democracy. Even China talks about democracy in whatever weird conception they have. Yes. Yeah. So the legitimacy is that way. And that's why I have actually argued that great powers aspire not just for power, but they aspire for authority, which is a combination of legitimacy and power. So let me get back to legitimacy and power. What does legitimacy do, you might ask, right? So legitimacy does not necessarily mean that there will be no conflict at all. But what legitimacy will do is, if there are challenges to a world order, they will happen as adjustments to the existing order rather than fundamentally changing it. For example, we are in a world order which is determined by free trade, or that is a narrative, right? Free trade, democracy, etc. Human rights. So even when China is challenging it, China is not doing it. These are all highly legitimate concepts. So China is also trying to adjust its own values around these, or talking in the same language, rather than saying that we don't agree to these principles at all. In fact, now it is championing free trade, like you saw. Then second idea is power, the big idea, right? So what does power do, you might ask? So power, again, if there's a balance of power, it doesn't mean, again, there won't be any conflict. But what a balance of power will do is, if there is fundamental competition to an existing order, many countries can align and then, suppress another state which is questioning a particular order. So that's the value of balance of power and legitimacy.
So could you argue that like India was this trying to rally the third world when US and USSR were the big powers, but effectively those two powers either co-opted, coerced, or suppressed this third world from really being very important or powerful.
Absolutely, yeah. In the sense, if you see, it was a very legitimate idea. It was a decolonization period. Everyone thought that these states shouldn't be under colonial rule. So legitimacy was high, but the power was absolutely low, right?
Right,
So
and not just that, there were
question.
great orators, Nehru and Nasser and others were these considered leaders, but ultimately they didn't have power.
Yeah.
So legitimacy has a lot to do with belief, right?
Yep.
So when we say the US's invasion of Iraq is often questioned. The US had the power to do it, but people didn't really believe why the US went to do it. They didn't believe the narrative of weapons of mass destruction, which is why US's legitimacy in this action was questioned. Am I right?
Absolutely, yeah. In fact, a lot of actions of the US have been questioned because of the legitimacy part, right? And it's not just because of Trump or anyone. It's these series of actions in Iraq, in Afghanistan, etc., which have come to question, right? When US stands for a liberal order, free trade, sovereignty, these are the principles which have made it a legitimate power. And when it itself violates it, there have been questions raised, and that has happened over the last 1.5 decades.
That's an interesting point. And if we connect it to what Pawan was saying about how America is perceived as a sort of evil imperialist power, whose corporations are just pushing globalization on everyone else's throats, that's essentially what we're seeing is the legitimacy of the US as this unquestioned leader of the free world sort of thing is increasingly being questioned. And especially after the election of Donald Trump, the less said about him, the better. We can really see that it's not just being questioned by people on random forums on the internet, but also by other global leaders who are trying to step up and assume the legitimate mantle of the US as a so-called leader of the world.
Yeah, I mean, we had Ameya Naik on the show, and something that we were talking about is if America is reneging on its treaty with Iran, why should North Korea have any belief in striking up any sort of fair deal, right?
Exactly.
And this goes back to what we're talking about legitimacy and corroding the legitimacy of the US.
If you think about this, the British Empire often went out of its way to present itself as an honest broker. Whether they were actually honest or not is obviously very, very debatable. But that's the image they tried to cultivate on the global stage, especially among European powers. Why is that? Legitimacy.
Okay.
Yeah. So this was what Kissinger said, right? It was only in the realm of power and politics. But the way we visualize it, that there is another important axis to look at. So, and that axis is of economics. Okay. So, one axis is how the power is spread across the world, which is just politics, in which you will have what are the possible combinations, a multipolar order in which there are many states, many regional powers across the world, a unipolar world in which you had the US, then there is a bipolar world which is competing. So let's say there's a new Cold War scenario where US and China are again at loggerheads with each other, or US and China can be cooperating with each other. Those are the two extremes. So these are some of the arrangements around the political axis. But then the second important factor, which I think Kissinger misses, and that's what we bring in our analysis about what happens to economy across the world. I think Anirudh can talk about it.
So we've conceptualized geoeconomics in 4 different ways. So we've thought of a low growth scenario, a new recession like what we saw in the 1920s in the USA, a low growth scenario, which we call the secular stagnation, which is what you see in the world after 2008. We have a new economic boom. And finally, we have a great disruption, which is my personal favorite, because it's one where essentially AI and technology massively change the structure of the world.
So basically, when technology and innovation sort of change the existing paradigms as we know it.
Exactly.
So this is sort of Mark Andreessen's thesis, right? Software is eating the world. So sort of this idea that all growth now will come from software, not like computing between the 1950s and the 2000s, the technological advancement and sort of economic output was incumbent on hardware growth.
Yeah.
But now it's to software.
Right. But there's a different change to it. Like, it's not just about AI. For example, it is also a great disruption scenario is also about changing the most important resources that will drive the world. So, for example, today we see it's the petrol, the petrochemical resources which are the most important ones, right? Earlier it was coal, then it was the area of petroleum.
And increasingly also silicon.
Correct. So now this great disruption scenario might be a place in which rare metal earths would be the most important resources.
Exactly.
So there will be a contestation for that. So it will still not be just software. It will still be, how can you make the best chips or the fastest chips or best solar panels or whatever.
And it's also about who develops the IP for the next generation of gene editing therapies,
Yes.
the next generation of antibiotics, everything. Right?
Yeah.
So wait, you guys have come up with these political scenarios and these economic scenarios, but they will meet somewhere, right? You could have a great disruption and a multipolar world, or a great disruption and a unipolar world.
Yes.
So how do you figure out the combinations of these?
So I'm very glad you brought up the great disruption in the multipolar world, because actually one of the most interesting new world orders that we've thought of, and we call it digital Westphalia. Because think about a world where conflict is now done through technology. You no longer have conventional conflict. You probably won't have these open warfare, but you will have any number conflict through cyber warfare, essentially. And the kind of opportunities it presents for India are absolutely fascinating, which hopefully we'll get into later. But coming to the intersection that Hamsini talked about, we visualize this as a table, right? So Pranay talked about geopolitics being about global polarity, right? So on one side of the axis, we have a unipolar world with the US being the sole superpower. And on the other end, we have a multipolar world. In terms of geoeconomics, on one end, we have the low growth, great recession sort of scenario. And on the other end, we have the great disruption scenario. So what you have is 5 different geopolitical trends, and 4 different geoeconomic trends. And at their intersection, we have 20 world orders. And this table is actually in our New World Order research paper, which I highly recommend any listeners check out.
Okay, wait. Let's take a step back. We've had world orders before, right? You guys are proposing 20 possible world orders. But what about world orders that have existed before today?
Yeah. So many world orders have existed before. Think of it. Let's divide it into broader trends. Okay. So the world view, or now when I'm talking about world order here, I'm just meaning the first definition about what just a region or civilization feels about the just arrangements or balance of power. So the first world order in that sense was the Chinese order, right? Not the first one, but one of the most important ones. So what did the Chinese world order entail? So you remember these words, the Middle Kingdom mentality, the Central Kingdom, all that
the
stems
mandate
from
of heaven.
here. Yeah, all that stems from this conception. So the idea was that the one who ruled the Chinese society,
the son of heaven,
was the mandate. He had the mandate from the heaven, and there was no parallel to that person from across the world. No one could question him. So in fact, very interesting thing happened when Englishmen came to meet this Chinese emperor, and they said, "We represent the British emperor." They said, "What are you joking? Like, there is no other emperor. The only emperor is our emperor." So in fact, there is a beautiful letter in Howard French's book which the Chinese write to the British, and the way they admonish the British is just too good. Like, they just say, "What the hell, you guys don't even exist. Why are you calling yourself emperor? The only way you can come and trade with us is if you accept that we are the numero uno." Okay, so that was that. Think of this as currently when we talk about trade barriers, right? This was the ultimate trade barrier. The Chinese knew that they have a huge market. Everyone wants to trade with them. They knew that. So they just put 100% trade and non-trade barriers in today's language. And they said, you can trade with us. We don't want anything from you, because all that is needed in the world we already have. But you definitely want to trade with us and gain access to our market. So if you want to do that, accept that we are the only ones in the world.
Did the British accept it?
The Britishers accepted it initially. And then
we had the Opium Wars.
That's the century of humiliation.
All right.
But the Chinese world order also extends beyond that, right? It has a tributary system.
Yeah.
One of the reasons they thought everyone else beyond this system were barbarians, so as to speak.
Yeah. So broadly, you could say Chinese world order was, it divided the the earth into two things. One is civilization and one is non-civilization. Civilization is people who are at least cynicized to some extent. All others are non-civilization. Like, they don't just exist. Chinese were not bothered about them. And in the civilization also, there were, idea of a raw civilization and a cooked civilization and all those concepts. Very interesting ones. But what this idea meant is there was a concept called the Tianxia, which is everything under the heavens. So idea was that everything that is civilized, etc., is under this king, the Chinese emperor, and you have to accept this matter of fact. Like, if you question it, then we will go after you. So this was the idea of the Chinese world order.
And in that view, I think the reason why they called themselves the Middle Kingdom was because they were directly under heaven, and everybody else were just people around them, tributaries, and they didn't deserve to be treated as equals.
Yeah. So you become a tributary if you accept that the Chinese kingdom is the only emperor in this world, and then you can have a trading relationship with them. So that's how it sort of spread, and that's how the Tianxia idea just spread. That's how you had many tributaries.
So in that sense, the ancient Chinese worldview assumed that there was only one supreme emperor. The idea of a natural state of being where you have multiple kingdoms who exist and who have parallel legitimacy was alien to them.
Yes.
Right? It has to be just one.
Yes,
and them.
Exactly.
And some of those filter down to today, right? The idea of the one Han identity, even though it's an entirely constructed population, different ethnicities, different historicities have gone in. That again stems from that, right? We are one nation, one people, one state.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So is that why at a very fundamental level, the idea of two Chinas just bugs them? Even beyond the idea that there's this Taiwan and an old adversary who's there in an island somewhere?
Yeah, that's true. So the entire Chinese experience over the last 50 years has been about managing diversity, or not suppressing diversity to the extent that it doesn't become a problem for the leadership. So, for example, Mandarin is the only language which is spoken in China now. They call other languages dialects, okay? And those are completely mutually unintelligible languages. There were more than 100 of them. They've just said, no, there is one language which was spoken in Beijing, and that should be the language across China. So that's just one example of how that has played out.
That's like saying Kannada is a dialect of Tamil.
No, I think it's like saying Kannada is a dialect of Hindi, which will make more heads explode. All right, so this was the Chinese worldview. Anirudh, what were some of the others? How were Indians thinking about the world?
Thank you so much for asking me that question, because some of the other research I do is actually about this. So I'm sure that a lot of our listeners are already familiar with Kautilya, right? So in the Kautilyan worldview, it's centered around a king who is not called the son of heaven or the supreme emperor or whatever. He's just called the Vijigishu, which means a conqueror, right? So his neighbor is his enemy because he wants to conquer him, right? Which makes the neighbor's neighbor his friend. Because just think about this. For the neighbor's neighbor, he himself is the Vijigishu, right? Which makes the initial Vijigishu we started with his ally. And this goes on in concentric circles, right? So there's allies of allies and enemies of enemies and neighbors of neighbors of neighbors and neighbors. And none of these are seen as being inherently superior or more legitimate than any other one. So, of course, Kautilya has classifications where he says, the neutral king, the middle king, and so on and so forth. But the fundamental idea that he's playing with in the Arthashastra is that any king can go and conquer anybody else if he has the power. And if you try this to the broader Indian civilizational worldview, it's a little similar to the Chinese in the sense that we have this sacred geography that is within the Indian subcontinent. So it's very often asked as to why Indian kings didn't really leave the subcontinent. It's not because they weren't interested in going outside the subcontinent, but because there was no reason for them to. If you look at the Middle Ages, you guys have heard of the Rashtrakutas? So they're this kingdom that's centered in Maharashtra and Karnataka. And they're obsessed with Kannauj in North India. The reason being that Kannauj used to be the capital of this chap called Harshavardhana, and it's considered to be a symbol of imperial power. So you don't prove your imperial credentials by conquering the whole subcontinent. All you do is that you go to Kannauj. That's it.
And this happened later with Delhi, right?
Yes.
So if you rule Delhi, you rule Hindustan.
Exactly.
And the Mughals, the Lodhis, the various, the Aibaks and various people did this.
Another important part in this Indian and Chinese worldviews are both were basically regional orders, in a sense that both of them didn't aspire to conquer the whole world.
Or they thought they were the whole world, right?
Yeah, they thought so. They were not bothered about. So Indian, whatever the Vijigishu's realm was supposed to be the Indian subcontinent. So his primary obsession was just to bring the entire subcontinent under one rule. But not beyond the subcontinent, no, it was not even considered. Similarly, the Chinese didn't even consider the other world as civilization. So they were also not bothered about it. Now that changes. Now there is another world order which comes into being after that, which we must discuss, is the Islamic worldview.
Okay.
Now the Islamic world order was very different. It was aspiring to be global in nature, unlike the other two. In fact, Islam was at once a religion, a multi-ethnic superstate, and a new world order. All three rolled into one.
All right.
Okay, so the Islamic idea was quite interesting. So there was this one area which was called the Darul Islam, which is the realm of peace. Why was it realm of peace? Because it was already conquered. The religion of peace was already there. It was conquered. There was Islam there, and it was governed by the caliphate. And the idea was that only under a caliphate and the principles which are there in the Quran, you can actually achieve peace. So these were Darul Islam was a region where this had already happened. Outside this Darul Islam was this region called the Darul Harb, which was regions where Islam wasn't the dominant region, and
but
the idea,
Islam was present.
Yeah, so there is another Darul Sulah, a third one in this, where there is Islam, but there is a temporary peace which exists with the Darul Islam. But the idea was similar, that ultimately the entire world should be Darul Islam.
Okay.
That was the idea. So it was a global world order in a sense. That and the idea was that those outside this Darul Islam, because Islam hadn't reached them completely, that was not a realm of peace. They were still backward. They had not realized the truth, and that's why Darul Islam had to spread. So this was an Islamic world order which dominated.
So what's the idea of the Ummah?
Yeah, so Ummah is similar, right? It's the global state. It's the state which exists because of conquering all this.
So Ummah was the goal of Islam and
the expansion of the Ummah was yes.
Okay. So, but coming back to India, so the idea was that multiple powers existing simultaneously was considered legitimate.
Yes.
Right, and
in not within India, like as in they were legitimate, but ultimately the Vijigishu had to.
The aim was to conquer.
Yes. But even the conquests that Indian kings undertook, right? If you look at the expansion of Chinese empires, you generally see that they set up an administration, they take over it because they can obviously do the job better than the barbarians can. But an Indian king who goes about conquering, he defeats his rival, but then accepts him as a vassal. He doesn't expunge his administration. He admits that this guy has some degree of sovereignty, but he's the suzerain.
Okay. And of course, this power and legitimacy was achieved not just by conquest, but by rituals and yagas and so on.
Exactly.
Okay. What place of the world have we left?
Europe.
Yeah.
Europe, absolutely.
Yeah. Europe is an interesting one. And in fact, the world order that we say now, or we commonly conceptualize it as of today, it stems from what happened in Europe in 1648.
If we could briefly touch upon this before 1648, right? Because it's not like Europe just discovered something in 1648. I think it's a very interesting contrast with the Islamic worldview because there are a lot of similarities as well. If you think about the Holy Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire, they saw themselves as successors of the Romans, but not like the ancient pagan Roman, but rather Christian Romans, right? Who believed that they were the vice regents of God on earth and that they had a right to use religion to go about conquering. So they're not really that different from the Islamic worldview in that sense. Why did Europe invade the West Asia during the Crusades? Because they believed that the world should be Christian. Why did the Pope allow the Spanish and Portuguese to go out into the world to spread Christianity? Because they believed that Christianity should be the world religion. So there are a lot of similarities, and you can kind of see how these two ideologies that are in close geographic proximity are interacting with and influencing each other.
And perhaps that's because before the world order that we now follow today, the Westphalian order, sovereignty came from God in a sense, right? Whether you're talking about the Chinese or the Islamic worldview or even your Byzantine Empire,
Or Indians.
You were a representative of God on earth.
Yes.
So, and therefore it was your duty to go out. So that's perhaps one major change that happened.
So then now we should come to something which was quite the opposite, which was this Westphalian order, right? So, and the fantastic part is the Westphalian order was quite different from all these orders in the sense that it said that it recognized sovereignty over domestic affairs of a particular state. It recognized that all states are at least nominally equal in international law, irrespective of the size, the shape that they have. Fundamentally different, right? Compared to all the things that we've discussed now. And this wonderful idea didn't come out of some unique moral insight. Okay, it just came because there was something called the 30 Years' War, and all the powers basically exhausted themselves for over 30 years. Then they met in a series of meetings in towns around Westphalia in Germany, and then they just agreed, man, none of us can conquer the entire Europe. Even we know, even you know, like we've done this for 30 years now. So let's just agree that we'll not conquer each other and we'll agree to something called sovereignty over domestic affairs and certain common principles which were acceptable to a large number of people. And that's how you enter this.
Right. If I can do a shameless plug, in episode 42, we have Ameya Nayak who talks to us about sovereignty.
Okay.
What the Westphalian idea of sovereignty was and how that has become further strengthened today, right? I mean, today, sovereignty to us also means that you have control over borders and movement of people, which is not necessarily something which was in the Westphalian idea. I mean, people could still move, their nationality was whatever it was, right? And that's changed. Okay, so you have this Westphalian worldview where now you legitimately acknowledge other powers and their sovereignty, and then you will still try to conquer here and there, but otherwise you try and leave them alone. Right?
Yeah. But you have some principles, right? Like non-interference, for example.
So that's what the legitimacy of the order is based on. And the power on which is based is the balance of power between all these European states that are unable to conquer each other. So when you have somebody who upsets the balance of power, you see the entire order being shaken up. And a great example of this is Napoleon Bonaparte. So he's immensely powerful, but nobody really accepts him as a legitimate emperor of France. So his career wraps up in pretty short order and is replaced with the concert of Europe, which is a balance of power between all the major European powers.
So is it right to say then that any world order tries to preserve itself? That the incumbents in a world order, it makes sense for them to protect the existing order.
Absolutely.
Right? So in this case, Napoleon was this upstart, he had all this power, but the existing powers in the Westphalian system all ganged up to get rid of this guy, right? Because he was not playing by the rules established by them. We see that even today, right? You have the UN, you have the permanent 5 members, you have pretty much the same members who have highest voting rights in the World Bank and IMF.
Yes.
And you have to play by their rules.
Yeah, Pawan, actually, that's precisely how we understand a changing world order. Or when we say the world order is changed, what are the factors which actually go into changing a world order are exactly these. So going back to our legitimacy, power, economics framework, we are saying that the world has changed because there's a change in these 3 things. Why do we say legitimacy has changed? We say legitimacy has changed because one way the legitimacy can change is the countries which actually uphold a particular world order. If they don't agree to the same principles they are going across touting across the world, is when you would say they are no longer legitimate. What are they saying when they are not themselves? Example of this is US talking about free trade and then imposing trade tariffs on China and a whole lot of other countries. Right? So that is when legitimacy breaks down. Power shifts have been happening since you mentioned about the permanent 5 and all that. The power shifts have been happening since then. And those which were the most powerful back then are no longer the most powerful ones now. Even though China was there in P5 earlier, but Now China is probably the second most important state. India is the one very important state. Germany is an important
And lots
state.
of states are clamoring to be in this sort of permanent member syndrome, right? For this reason.
They are clamoring, but essentially what that says is that the power as it is represented in that order is no longer, it doesn't represent reality as it exists now.
Okay, so let me try to understand this. So supposing you have this one setup where you have the UN, you have a Security Council, you have 5 permanent members who are nuclear weapon states, legitimate nuclear weapon states. If there are 3-4 countries who are trying to also become permanent members, then they are trying to just improve themselves within that world order, right? As opposed to someone like China coming out and saying, yeah, I might be in the UNSC and so on, but I will just downgrade that entire setup and I'll create a Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I'll run all my business there. I'll not even bother the UN with things. I will set up, what they've done with the OBOR, right?
Yes.
One Belt, One Road. We will set up our own courts to settle disputes. So they are creating a parallel order, right?
Yes.
So that's the difference between the two.
They are creating a Sino-centric order in which currently it is regional order in that sense, where it is Asian Infrastructure Bank, there
there's
is
an ASEAN,
BRI, there is SCO. But ultimately the idea is that why not become the most powerful ones? The world order should be determined by us. If we are the most powerful ones, why should US be the one?
All right. That makes sense. But, Pranay, there's a lot of talk about how the world order is changing. US is not legitimate anymore. If we had a world order that was led by China, it would be a better world order. Right? Is that necessarily true?
From an Indian point of view, that is absolutely false. Okay. The way I would put it is, many times even I hear this argument that, US is a hypocrite, US behaves in hypocritical manner, China also behaves in hypocritical manner, so what? Like, India can still continue to be what it is. This mistakes a fundamental understanding of this world order. Now, think of it this way. What is the current new world order? What are the principles which are considered to be legitimate? Free trade, plurality, then democracy,
fundamental rights,
right? None of these are things which India has conflicts with, right? We all aspire to uphold these. In fact, India itself is an example of a plural order in a regional sense, right? So there is no conflict with this. When US violates this, we of course raise our voice, and every state does. So currently there's a norm, and the norm is fits very well to what India desires as well. And when US deviates from that norm, we keep questioning why the US is deviating. But when China becomes, let's say we imagine a Sino-centric world, that norm itself changes completely. Okay, so we were talking about how plurality is not a big deal in China, right? So then you would have a norm for the world order which would be against pluralism. It might be against democracy, definitely against democracy. It will just probably elevate authoritarianism. All these go against what is in India's yogakshema or interest, right? So that's why if we have a Sino-centric world order, it will be really bad for India.
So there might also be elements of mercantilism, like sort of new mercantilism in the Chinese model, right? I mean, we are seeing that already with Hambantota in Sri Lanka and elsewhere. We will finance everything. If you go under, then we'll buy you over. And the state has such a large role to play, sort of overseeing the private sector and controlling it, which is again very different from what India has, right? India has a private sector which is sort of leading on most counts, very similar to the United States.
Absolutely, yeah. So all these will be the new norms, and none of these, I can't even figure out one norm which sort of agrees to what Indian thinking and Indian strategic thought has been. So it's going to be a really tough time. We won't be left with this questioning US because they have not upheld a norm. The norms itself will be so harmful for India that we'll be in deep trouble.
And we can't even question China for fear of what they might do.
Yeah, the questioning is out of the
it's out of the question.
Yeah.
We have to accept the mandate of heaven.
Yes.
Even though it's a communist government. So, thanks, Pranay. Anirudh, can you give us a little bit of a glimpse of maybe one or two world orders that you've imagined in the future, and sort of how India can behave in that. So like right now we discussed a xenocentric world order. Anything else?
If I could bring it back to the conversation we were having about Westphalia, let's talk about this digital Westphalia idea that we had, right? Does anybody here have an idea of why China is so interested in Africa right now? What do they get out of Africa?
Raw materials.
What raw materials? Rare earths.
Okay.
So China, and Manoj probably could talk about this a lot more authoritatively, but China really has a clear vision in mind for what they want to do with technology. They understand that the global distribution of resources is not the same. They understand that disruption is inevitable, and they're preparing for it. So the case that we are making is that India lives in the same world that China does. We know that a disruption is inevitable, and we need to prepare for it. And I think the digital Westphalia scenario really helps clarify our thinking on the matter. So to reiterate, the digital Westphalia is a world where geoeconomics is shaped by the Great Disruption. In geopolitics, we are living in a multipolar world. So no one world power is more powerful than any others. We're going to be in a situation where India is going to struggle with massive job losses since, let's face it, we are not one of the most innovative economies in the world right now. And one of the suggestions we have is that to cope with this, India needs to be extremely aggressive about investing in R&D. And it has to be innovative about it, right? So like, let foreign universities set up campus here, invest in skilling up the workforce as much as possible. And if necessary, just to protect ourselves from job loss, we might even want to consider temporarily raising a few trade barriers before eventually opening up when our industries are mature enough to compete. And just if you think about the broader structure of the world, at least for me as a bit of a history nerd, it's very similar to the 18th and 19th centuries, where countries that have massive technological edges over the rest of the world are going to go out and try to use these other countries for nothing more than economic growth, right? So just as the Europeans used gunpowder to essentially turn India and China into colonies and markets, you would see something similar in a Great Disruption scenario where countries that have the best IP, the best technology, would have a massive edge over countries that don't. So what India could do is form an alliance of countries that are less technologically advanced, maybe use it as a market sharing or market access sort of block to negotiate with the more advanced countries in order to safeguard our national interests. And coming back to the discussion we were having about resources, India, especially a disruption scenario, is very good for India because it means we can achieve our security objectives at less cost. So invest in smart or sharp power, right? I'm not sure what the exact IR term for that is. But basically invest in cyber warfare, shift from having a massive human army to maybe a robotic army, shift from firepower to cyber power, something like that. And especially shift towards the Indian Ocean. So Africa, as I said, has plenty of rare earths. So does Tibet, incidentally, but we clearly can't do anything about that. But investing in a larger naval presence, investing in resource extraction consortiums, building up a sovereign wealth fund to acquire innovative startups across the world, right? It means that India is going to have to think big and think smart to really defend our national interest.
And this is a future where which is building up on a present where we spend less than 1.5% of the GDP as public expenditure on research.
Yeah, exactly.
I think private sector research less than 1% of GDP. So we are not necessarily in the best of places right now to manage this particular scenario.
That's why what we done was, so imagine the exercise is basically two axes, right? One was politics, economics. At the intersection, you have 25 worlds. So for each of these worlds, we did three things. One, try to imagine how this world would look like. Second, how would this affect India? Third, what should India be doing in order to safeguard its interests? So what you just said fits into the second question, how will this affect India? And we realize there are some of these scenarios which we were, really antithetical to India's interests. They were not at all positive. Some of the scenarios were actually sort of midway, and some of them were very positive. So then what we did is combined the initiatives that need to be taken in each of these, so that irrespective of where the world goes, we don't want to predict the world. That's tough. many people have gotten it wrong. So, but irrespective of the world, where the world goes, if we are able to do these certain set of initiatives, like moving from firepower to cyberpower, from a territorial army to a naval superpower, then encouraging foreign universities, etc. These were scenarios that came across in all the scenarios, or most number of scenarios, and things that we should be doing irrespective of where the world goes.
Okay. So let's say the world is going to be the world tomorrow. We will open the studio doors and it will change drastically. Apart from these three things, what else should India be doing irrespective to deal with the world tomorrow?
So how we went about building this was just to build on what Pranay was saying. We looked at what India should be doing for each of these 20 scenarios, and we collected the recommendations that appear most frequently.
All right.
And we've used that to build our action portfolio. So let me just briefly talk about what exactly is in this portfolio. So we've divided our actions for India into two broad headings. The first are domestic, and the second are foreign-facing reforms. Domestically, we believe that liberalization is something that India has to do, because getting FDI, getting investment is vital for our growth. But we should not focus only on economic growth, considering the way that our demography is going to change over the next few decades. Creating jobs is going to be a major challenge. So job growth might at times be more important for us than just economic growth. We also need to build a social security net, because right now India is an overwhelmingly young country, right? We have people who can work. But in a few decades, the population that cannot work and that needs to be taken care of is going to be larger and larger, which means we need to have social security, and we should start building it right away.
And yeah, those social security net might be very different from how we imagine it today.
What's a social security net?
So social security net would be examples, would be unemployment insurance or things.
Okay,
That is what we think of it now. But because our exercise over the next 25 years, we might have to think of areas. Let's say, can I give you vouchers so that you can take up courses to change your skill set? Things like that. So those are really specific things which this is a broad exercise. But we need to think of new social security nets as well.
All right.
It's
What else,
basically,
Anirudh?
yes, just if I could just add to the social security idea, we call it a human capital approach to social security. And this is an idea that's been spoken about in academic circles for a while. But the idea is to see each citizen as a potential economic resource and invest in them so they can maximize their potential for the country. Okay, so coming back to the foreign-facing reforms that we talked about, so 3 critical military shifts are needed. From land to sea, so moving from a territorial navy to becoming a naval superpower, especially in the Indian Ocean region. From the physical to the virtual, right? So we need to be investing in cyber warfare, and moving from manpower to firepower. So we have one of the largest armies in the world, if not the largest, I think. We need to be shifting to having more firepower. We still use World War II era weapons, which is fairly ridiculous for a country that aims to be a regional superpower. We also need to champion the cause of globalization, because the movement of labor and goods is really critical to our growth. In terms of geopolitics, we need to retain flexibility in terms of alignment. So this is something that India has historically been pretty good at. We haven't really signed up onto the American, global alliance. We haven't really signed on to the alliance that they're trying to build. We believe that we must, in order to safeguard our national interests, we have to retain flexibility. So if that means tying up with Russia, tying up with Iran, if it's in the national interest, then so be it. And finally, be open to partnering with other middle powers, especially those concerned by G2 dominance, right? So it's almost inevitable in our view over the next few decades that the US and China are going to be global superpowers. And it's also inevitable that there are going to be other middle powers that are concerned about it.
Yeah, that's a fascinating thing when you talk about middle powers. Pawan, Australia actually recently released an India Economic Strategy 2035.
Okay.
I don't think India has an India Economic Strategy 2035. Okay, but they have released and they have tried to. So Australia is a middle power which will be important for us in the next 25 years, and they have actually made really good recommendations about how Australia should engage specific states in India and which are the states to engage and things like that. So that is a similar mirror exercise is what we need to do to engage some of these middle powers.
Right, because India engaging Australia means Queensland engaging Karnataka and
yes.
Bangalore working with Sydney and so on.
Yeah,
right?
they have realized that, so they already have.
The
Bangalore
state of
itself
Victoria actually released a report earlier this year, which was talking about how it, as the state of Victoria, could partner with other states within India, like Karnataka, like Tamil Nadu, and what they could improve on.
Wow. Okay.
So
So
that
we
is
are headed towards a brave new world.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Anirudh. Thanks, Pranay. I want to end with one thing. So the purpose of all this, what India should be doing in these various scenarios and so on, is not just to maximize its power, right? What's the end goal that we are looking at?
No, that's a very good question. And see, the pursuit of power again is not just for the sake of it, right? What is important is what you do with that power. And that's why what we are trying to argue is, if India, let's say, is the most powerful world power, if it brings the principles on which the Indian Republic is based on across the world, that is ideas of pluralism, freedom, the respecting an individual and things like that, if those are brought to the fore by India, then India being a world power is beneficial to the entire world. So that is what we are aspiring for. And if India itself goes in an opposite direction, and India disbands the principles on which the Indian Republic is based, then maybe India, being the most powerful state in the world, might not be in the world's interest or even in Indians' interest.
And the primary purpose of this, at least as being slightly selfish Indians, is that it's for the prosperity of all of us, right? Not some abstract power for the state, but for the prosperity and well-being of Indians.
Absolutely. Yeah. The peace and prosperity of Indians is the aim. Yep.
So on that note, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you guys. Thanks, Pranay. Thanks, Anirudh. That's it for today's show. If you're interested in reading up about today's discussion, you can check out the discussion document that Pranay and Anirudh have authored called Deriving India's Strategies for a New World Order, which is available on the website of the Takshashila Institution. That is www.takshashila.org.in. Anirudh has also written an article about it on the Pragati website at www.thinkpragati.com. You can listen to the Pragati podcast on the IVM podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts from. We're there everywhere.
Every week comes a show where three people come together to tell you about stuff they like. A movie, a TV show, a book, and other stuff. Tune in every Monday on the IVM podcast app to IVM Likes. Batman approves this message. Thank you, Batman.
Hello there, my name is Naveen Narona, and as a gay person in India, I get asked a lot of stupid questions.
Beta, is it LGBT or eligibility?
How do two men procreate?
Bro, is Grindr better than Tinder or what?
We answer all these questions and much more on my podcast, Keeping It Queer, where I talk to individuals from the LGBT community in India and learn about their personal stories. Catch all the episodes on the IVM podcast app or any other podcasting app you like. Till then, keep it queer.